Questions and comments? The Honourable Member from Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his comments today. I just want to quote to the member what Jeffrey Simpson from the Globe and Mail said in a column on May the 28th, 2010. He said, I quote, "A corner of Muskoka is being turned into a militarized zone. Downtown Toronto shut off. Baseball games moved out of town. Thousands of police and security agents mobilized, to say nothing of helicopters, planes, and for all we know, submarines in Lake Ontario. The whole thing's over the top, way too expensive for 3 days, and a bid fare to be a non-event in substance." Now, that's what he said about it. The question is, if we accept that an urban setting is not the proper place for this type of event, and the fact that people are concerned about military in the streets, why wouldn't the government consider simply putting the whole event in a secure military base where the costs should be almost zero? I want to ask the government member whether he could respond to that and tell us why that couldn't have been done.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
I'm not familiar with Jeffrey Simpson choosing not to read the Globe and Mail on a regular basis, but I will quote from Sheila Fraser on the costs. And the Honourable Member might have heard of Ms. Fraser. She's the Auditor General of Canada. Obviously, $1 billion is a lot of money, but I think we have to recognize that security is expensive. There are a lot of people that are involved over a long period of time. We may think the meetings only last for a few days, but all the preparations involve extensive planning, extensive coordination for months before that, and I think we have to be really, really careful. So, Mr. Speaker, Toronto was chosen. There's some debate concerning the location, whether the locations were appropriate. The honourable members, they can't decide whether they wanted an urban riding or an urban area or a rural riding, because they also criticize the government when one of the summits is proposed to be in rural Ontario. The reality is wherever these summits are going to be located, there's going to be security. There's going to be expensive security. We owe that not only to Canadians who reside in those areas, we owe that to the delegations and the world leaders that we could be coming. And we also owe that security to the people who will be engaged in lawful protests, because they too need to be protected. We don't want to see any incidents of violence or protests that get out of hand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Ajax-Pickering.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to quote something here. This was, again, I mentioned in my speech, September 25th, 2009, the Industry Minister, MP for Parry Sound, said, quote, "There may be some minor augmentations to the existing G8 budget," talking about adding the G20, "but I would argue they should be minor. After all, one of the advantages of holding both in Muskoka would be the cost advantages." So the minister acknowledged at that point that by holding them in one common venue, it would contain the cost, keep it much cheaper. Would the member not agree that by splitting it into two different venues, one in a downtown urban environment, which is a security nightmare with underground tunnels and towers, that they specifically chose to have behind buildings for a good photo op as opposed to putting in another area in Toronto where it would have cost a lot less? Would he not agree with his cabinet minister's own assertion that this would have been much cheaper to do in one venue? Therefore, would he not agree that this would have made sense to get the venue right in the first place, choose a location that would have been much cheaper and easier to secure? And does he not question, as the Minister of Public Safety has publicly, what the size of these costs? Does he not think that for 72 hours, $1.2 billion is an outrageous amount of money?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept the premise that the locations were incorrectly chosen in the first place. However, I'm not a security expert, and certainly the Honourable Member Ajax-Pickering is not a security expert. The reality is that security is a necessity at these summits. We're going to have all of the world leaders are going to be at the G8, the G20 summits. They require protection. The issue is whether or not the costs of these summits and providing security is in line with similar summits that have been hosted in other parts of the world. And as I said in my main speech, University of Toronto expert John Curtin, who's attended every G8, I think, since 1988, said, and I'll quote again because I don't think the Honourable Member for Ajax-Pickering heard me the first time, "The costs for each of the two Canadian summits are more or less within the range of what G8 and even G20 summits have been costing. It is a very good investment. Most of the money has permanent benefits, well beyond the G8. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was on a panel last week with the member for Oxford, member of this government, who publicly stated that the government knew all along, from the very beginning, that the costs of this summit would be in the $900 million range. That's not my words, that's the words of the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety. Yet, this government put the figure of $179 million in the estimates tabled on March 3rd. My question to this member is, if this government believes in transparency and accountability, and if they knew all along that the costs were $900 million, why this government would have represented to Canadians just a little over 65 days ago that the costs would be $179 million.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And clearly the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway does not understand how the parliamentary budget system works, and that's why he's in a fourth party and likely always will be. In March, $179 million was allocated as part of the overall security budget for the G8 and G20 summits. The recently tabled Supplementary Estimates A allocate a further $654 million. As we've always stated, overall costs will be finalized following the completion of the summits. However, based on a medium-level threat assessment, we budgeted up to $930 million for security. So, Mr. Speaker, this is the normal budgetary process. The $179 million was allocated as part of the overall budget security. That was never intended to be the entire amount.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, it's becoming very clear in this debate that there are people who are, in fact, security experts that prefer to deal with factual information, and there are those that, particularly the member from Ajax Pickering, who think they're security experts and facts never got in their way of telling their story. Mr. Speaker, I think that the member from Edmonton Strathcona Edmonton St. Albert has clearly articulated that when you're talking about this particular issue, to be factual, you should be talking about apples to apples rather than apples to oranges, and using numbers that are realistic to use a comparison. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the member from Edmonton St. Albert if he is aware of, and I just came in, I don't know if this came up, that the cost of putting on the G8, I think it is in Hokkaido, recently was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion, which would in fact be much more than the total cost of the two events that we're putting on in Canada. Do I have that number correct?
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
That's correct, Mr. Speaker. The costs for the one summit in Hokkaido, Japan, were $1.5 billion. And as I said in my main speech, I quoted from Integrated Security Unit Chief Ward Alcock, as the honourable member raised a good question, that you cannot compare apples to oranges or to any other fruit. And the Integrated Security Unit Chief Alcock said, I think Canada is one of the rare countries that is being transparent about these security costs. If you could actually compare apples to apples, the costs are going to be fairly comparable. So, Mr. Speaker, when the opposition rails on and on about these costs are out of the ballpark of what normal security costs for other summits, they're just being disingenuous, as the honourable member pointed out, is $1.5 billion for Hokkaido, Japan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.